Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilden is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 7 of my One Night in Karazhan card review. This time around I have 6 neutral cards to take a look at, so let's go ahead and jump right in, starting out with what I think might actually be one of the strongest cards in the entire set so far. This is a new giant, the Arcane Giant at 12 mana, in 8/8, of course, like every giant, and it costs 1 less for each spell you've cast this game. Compared to something like Frost Giant, I think that's pretty fantastic. The problem with Frost Giant is that usually hero powering is the last resort. It's not something you're actively doing every turn, but there are a lot of decks that love casting spells, and it's not a punishment to cast a spell, much like a hero power often feels like wasted or leftover mana. Usually you want to use your spells, and it's not going to be that hard to cast 6, 8, 10 spells in a reasonably short amount of time, say within the first 6 to 10 turns of the game, depending upon the deck, meaning that you're going to have Arcane Giants hitting the field that are 4 mana, 2 mana, free at some point in the game against or with certain decks, in particular decks like Tempo Mage, any Yogg-Saron deck that fits in a lot of spells, particularly Yogg Druid that just has a bajillion different ways to cast spells and draw cards, and likes to load up the board with minions. I could see a Yogg-Saron Giants Druid that runs Sea Giant, which has actually already been run in Yogg Druid before, but also add in some Arcane Giants so that when they go off on those big Violet Teacher turns, not only do they get the free Sea Giant, they also have a couple free Arcane Giants to play as well. So it's sort of a nightmare zone when in that deck, but also in Tempo Mage, right? Tempo Mage is a deck that can run out of gas in some ways as it reaches the later stages of the game. But imagine them top decking a free 8/8 that they can play along with whatever they were going to do anyway. And you've got a pretty scary deck that suddenly has high tempo, low cost, super strong card to play. And that's very, very scary. Much like Sea Giant was scary in Zoo, this is that kind of card, right? A free 8/8 is often a nightmare to deal with. So I really like this card. Even if you play it as a 6 mana 8/8, that's not so bad in decks that otherwise don't have a ton of big minions. And just developing that kind of threat is enough to win games sometimes. So it's not like you have to cast 12 spells to make this thing free, but that is going to happen, and there are decks that do that very well. So either way, I can see a lot of people fitting Arcane Giant into their list. This might be our new Giant Overlord. It's probably the strongest of the Giants in the game right now as far as I'm concerned, and an overall really good card. So let's go ahead and move on to the next Arcane card. This time it's the Arcane Anomaly, a 1 mana minion. It's got 2/1 in stats, and whenever you cast a spell, give this minion +1 health. Pretty cool little effect. It's like an opposite Mana Worm in many ways. But 1 mana 2/1s are usually what you want to see in Arena. In Constructed, typically you want it to have the health first, so it's just not super susceptible. In other words, playing this on 1 and following it up on turn 2 with a spell is a little bit risky just because your opponent might be able to hero power it down, and you don't often have ways to play spells immediately at that point in the game. Of course, there is this into coin into another 1-drop, which is pretty solid because that means you get a 1 mana 2/2 basically, and then it just continues to grow. But it's always going to have 2 attack, so it's not like it's going to be a menacing card. It's not like an aggressively minded card. It's not the Tunnel Trog or the Mana Worm that just hit your opponent really hard all the time. So this one's going to be more about board control basically. So I actually think this is a Priest card. This is the replacement for Zombie Chow in Priest. Play Arcane Anomaly, coin, Power Word, Shield, and suddenly you have a 2/5 on the board on turn 1. That's kind of good to trade into like Zoo style decks that just want to load up with cheap minions. So I think the card is surprisingly playable. You don't see that many low cost neutrals being added to the game that get played. But this one could be in the right deck. I don't know. I'm curious to see. It's got a good effect that scales very well. And it's an early game card that can fit into any deck, or at least any class's deck. That could make it good in a few places. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this one sneak its way into some lists. Moving on to a card I would be surprised to see play. This is the 3-mana Pantry Spider. It's a 1/3 beast with the battle cry, summon another 1/3 spider, which is also a beast, just so you know. So you get 2 beasts with a total of 2/6 in stats, which suddenly sounds pretty good when you compare it to things like Carrion Grub, or even Oasis Snapjaw, which costs 2 mana more and only gives you 1 additional health. The problem, of course, is that 2 1/3s do not behave like a 2/5. In other words, 2 1/3s trading into a 3/2 both die in order to kill the 3/2. But a 2/5 trading into a 3/2 survives as the 2/2. So I think the goal here is to give both Druid and Hunter a beast synergy card that has a very high likelihood to stick onto the board. And in other words, 1/2 of this should live most of the time on turn 3. But that's honestly not a guarantee. By turn 3, your opponent has ways to very efficiently kill 1/3s. Often by trading in 3/2s, for instance, a couple Flame Imps will decimate your Pantry Spiders and leave you with nothing. So I don't think this is as good as the other 3-mana beasts that both Druid and Hunter have access to. That is Druid of the Flame and Carrion Grub. I see no reason to run this. So I think this card will never see play in Constructed, and I don't even think it's particularly good in Arena, to tell you the truth. So that's pretty unfortunate. I think they've wasted a card slot here. This one is bad. Moving on to another card I'm not a huge fan of. It's the 1-mana Runic Egg. It's a 0/2 with the Death Rattle, draw a card. So it's, like an Nerubian Egg, but with a much worse Death Rattle. Not that drawing a card is bad, particularly for 1 mana, but it's just hard to think of ways to utilize this card in a lot of different decks. So obviously with egg decks, you want buffs, things that activate 0 attack cards, so that you can actually attack with them and somehow kill them, because your opponent is not going to kill it for you most of the time. So you want activators, and typically what that means is you take mana in the early game, spend 1 mana here, and you hope that investment pays off later by giving you board control. That's what Nerubian Egg has been about. That's what the Dragon Egg card is about. They help you build the board. This one is an alternative to that. It does not help you build the board. It helps you generate cards. So I don't think it makes as much sense with buff cards, because buffs work so well with eggs, because you want to build the board, you want to buff the board, and you want to go forth. When you build the board with eggs and then you buff your egg and you draw a card, it doesn't accomplish quite the same goal. Now, that said, still having a minion that's almost guaranteed to live because your opponents don't want to kill it can be nice. Card cycle can be good. I'm not saying this card's totally unplayable. I just don't know who's going to use it or what deck it's going to fit into. And if you do put a big buff on it, your opponent's not going to feel that discouraged by killing it, because it's just a card. It's not going to contest the board immediately. So I don't see this one, right? I'd rather just run Loot Hoarder because it attacks. It has guaranteed value of some sort, right? This is just such a passive card. And at 1 mana, it's awfully slow as well. So I don't feel Runic Egg is going to make any waves. Moving on to another neutral minion. It's the 5-mana Avian Watcher. This is a 3/6, and it has a battle cry. If you control a secret, gain +1/+1, and taunt. So that's a 4/7 taunt when you do have a secret. Other 5-mana taunts that feel pretty similar are Druid of the Claw, for instance, in Druid, but this one is a neutral card, but then again, it only works for 3 classes, Hunter, Paladin, and Mage. So I don't think it's great. I don't think it's overpowered. It's Druid of the Claw is not overpowered. It's only really good because of its flexibility as a charger or a taunt. There's nothing about a 4/6 taunt that just you throw your hands up and give up. And a 4/7 taunt is not any different. There are some consistency issues with this card as well. You don't always have a secret, right? So sometimes that won't go through. And even if it does, it's just not that amazingly powerful. I think it'd be pretty cool if it was, if you control secret, gain +1/+1 for each secret. So Paladin could play 5 secrets and suddenly have a giant minion, but that would probably be overpowered, particularly in Paladin, and not particularly well balanced with Mage or Hunter. So that's not unlikely to happen, but that would certainly make this card playable. As it stands right now, I just don't think it's great. If it was a beast, looks like an owl, but apparently it's some sort of construct. But if it was a beast, Hunter would probably love it because of the beast synergies, and just walling up with a secret would make it very hard to remove. But I don't think it's great in Paladin. I don't think it's great in Mage either. So I'm not saying the card is bad, because it can do things. It's okay. Just don't think it's good enough to make a list as we see it right now. But again, I would love to be surprised. Moving on to what I think is the final card in this review. It is the Menagerie Magician. Cute little witch here at 5 mana. She is a 4/4. And she has a battle cry, give a random friendly beast, dragon, and murloc +2/+2. This card falls right in line with Zubat, which has a very similar effect, and honestly pretty similar stats for its cost as well. But I think the Menagerie Magician is even worse than the Zubat. I don't particularly love the Zubat. I think Blizzard's idea is that there's some sort of deck archetype that exists here where you put these tribes all together and something cool happens. I guess it's got to do with board presence and buffs. But I think this card's going to be inconsistent, and it's a little heavy costed at 5 mana for that kind of deck. It's not a Doom Guard, right? So it's not impacting the board quite as quickly, and it's bad if you draw it on an empty board. It's only good if you do have minions, so it's much less consistent than Doom Guard. It's going to be really hard to get all 3 of those out, so this is usually give a +2/+2, and maybe occasionally give a +4/+4. If it's a give a +4/+4, it's a lot of stats for 5 mana. That's pretty good, because you basically get like a free Blessing of Kings. But that's not going to happen most of the time. You're never going to get 6/6, or at least very, very rarely. And I just still don't understand a deck that runs Murlocs and Dragons simultaneously and makes a lot of sense out of it. So I think there are consistency issues, and the card just doesn't have the raw stats or immediate impact, at least consistent immediate impact, to be playable. So I'm not a fan of the Menagerie Magician, nor her little buddy, the Zubat, but I'm certainly going to try to build that deck as soon as possible, because it could be cool and it could be fun to try it, but I just don't think it'll be good. So that wraps it up for part 7 of my review. This is a below average card that won't be played. This is an average card that won't be played. This is a below average card that won't be played. This is a bad card that won't be played. This is an above average card that might be played. And this is a really, really good card that will definitely see some play. And that's going to do it. If you have any thoughts or comments of your own, you know where to leave them. Thanks so much for watching. And until next time, game on.